Hello, everybody. I am thrilled to welcome you here today for another session, another expert fertility session in our Figuring Out Fertility series. My name is Carolyn Dubé. I'm the Executive Director at Fertility Matters Canada, and I'm here today with Dara Roth-Edney. Many of you will have seen her present with us in the past. Dara is a reproductive counselor. She owns a business called Informed Fertility, and I'm thrilled to have her here talking about third-party reproduction. So a lot of couples, a lot of individuals in Canada and obviously across the globe are able to use third-party reproduction to build their families when carrying a baby or when a partner's sperm or egg is unavailable for use. So we're thrilled today to kind of dig into what that means for individuals and couples and learn more about how this technology can really help us. We're probably going to touch a little bit on, Dara, how it's been affected third-party reproduction during the COVID era as well. We won't spend all of our time talking about that, but there is some important pieces to what that can look like. So why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what third-party reproduction is and all the different pieces, and then we can dig into it from there. If you've got questions and you're on Zoom or if you're on our Facebook page, please just leave your questions in the comment section and we'll be sure to get those answered.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And as always, thank you for Fertility Matters for putting on all of these amazing series. I deeply wish this kind of thing had been available when I was going through my own infertility. It's amazing to have so many people on and providing support to all the people out there who really, really need it. And especially now during COVID, when people are feeling isolated and when clinics had been closed for a while, and that obviously caused a significant amount of distress, and to be able to have this ongoing is amazing. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
So in terms of an introduction, as you said, yes, I have my own counseling practice providing support to people struggling with infertility and people who are accessing third-party reproduction for reasons of relationship status, people who are on their own, for reasons of sexual orientation and gender identity, and medical reasons people aren't able to have children without help, but not necessarily fertility related. So all kinds of people are using third-party. And in fact, I was one of them. So after many, many years of infertility and all of the horrible things that all of us go through when we're trying to conceive and struggling. So, you know, procedures and IVF and surgeries and all of that. And eventually I had my children with the help of gestational carriers. So I went through 2 surrogacy journeys to have my kids. And so I have that perspective on it as well as my professional perspective. You know, I think maybe one of the first things that you had suggested would be a good thing to just touch base on is really to clarify what we mean when we talk about third party. Absolutely. So the idea really of that language is that the primary, and in a way it's sort of interesting because it does suggest that there are 2 parties and then a third, and that's actually not always the case because of course people who are on their own do this as well. But the idea of third party reproduction is suggesting that people who are not going to be involved in the raising of children are going to be part of making that process happen and bringing that child into the world. So that would include egg donation, sperm donation, embryo donation, and gestational surrogacy. There are still people who do traditional surrogacy as well, although mostly it does tend to be gestational surrogacy, especially when we're talking about clinic involvement. So that difference, just to clarify, traditional surrogacy, which is the more long-standing way of doing surrogacy, is when the woman carrying the baby is also using her own egg. That's most often done with insemination, and it is most often done without clinic involvement. And so before it was possible to transfer an egg from one woman to another, that's what surrogacy really was. Now, for a variety of emotional, legal reasons, people do tend to do gestational surrogacy more. And in fact, most clinics won't allow traditional surrogacy. And so gestational surrogacy is when an egg is taken from one woman, either the intended mother or an egg donor, combined with sperm from either the male partner or a sperm donor. And the gestational surrogate is the one who carries that embryo, carries the baby. And so she has no genetic link to the baby that she's carrying. And so those would be the kinds of things that we talk about when we're talking about third-party reproduction, either the intended parents or parent, people who are hoping to become parents through this process, as well as the donors and the gestational or traditional surrogates who are helping with this process.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. I think it's always really important we use the term in the industry, third-party reproduction, or we throw around the word gamete. And sometimes, those words are foreign language. And so it's good to kind of clarify and help people feel more comfortable with the understanding of what this looks like.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's touch just a bit on COVID, and then we're going to move on. But when COVID hit and the clinics shut down and the borders shut down, what happened to third-party reproduction? Were there issues, bigger issues that sort of came up from that?
Yeah, so I mean, there were some things that did just continue. So for example, I provide counseling around third-party reproduction, and I've always been able to do that virtually. Clinics do require specific kinds of counseling before people do third-party. So they require a specific kind of counseling for people who are planning to become parents through donation or surrogacy. And they require a specific kind of evaluation assessment for people who are going to be donors and people who are going to be surrogates. So for me, that, and for all counselors, I imagine, for most of us, that work continued because that stuff needed to happen anyway. And people who would have met me in person, for the most part, were able to pivot and transition to doing that virtually. When you are doing a known donation, meaning the person who is providing the sperm or the egg or the embryo is somebody that you know, most clinics, I think, require a legal agreement in place. And actually, people will do legal agreements even with an agency donor if there's information that they want from the donor, ongoing medical information or some kind of exchange of information into the future. They'll often request to have a legal agreement, and that's always beneficial. So my understanding is that the lawyers were continuing to work virtually, although there were, I believe, some complicated things around signatures and consent. And so I can't speak to that directly,
Sure.
but I do know that people were still in touch with lawyers and that kind of thing was still happening. So there were certain elements that were continuing in that way. What really came to a halt were procedures and testing. So donors, surrogates, intended parents who had plans to go to a clinic to be approved to move forward, to find out if they were able to move forward, that stuff all stopped. And of course, actual transfers of embryos, egg retrievals, all of those kinds of things stopped. Interestingly enough, I did hear that there was an uptake in terms of surrogates. So for example, a lot of women who have been interested in being gestational carriers who like the idea of it, but who didn't actually have the time or had jobs that required heavy lifting or couldn't figure out kind of when they would have the time to be able to navigate that, all of a sudden are home. And so for some of those women, they realize actually now is a good time for them to be able to do this because they are home and some of the stressors of regular life have been waylaid, so to speak.
Wow.
So that I found very interesting.
That's really interesting.
On the other hand, one of the big complications is what you mentioned, borders closing. And so within Canada, we get our frozen eggs from the States primarily. There are fresh donor cycles, meaning women who are interested in being donors, who are going to the clinic and doing their egg retrieval and their donation in real time. That obviously stopped when the clinics were closed. And even when clinics were closed and the borders were closed, then that also meant that women who were traveling from different provinces couldn't come in to do the things, even if some of those things weren't necessarily a treatment, even if it was things like meeting the intended parents and definitely the treatment aspects of transfers and all of that. So I would say one of the things that would be a great question for people to ask if they are interested now in this and they are speaking to their clinic about moving forward with donor or surrogate would be to find out what kind of rules your clinic has. So some of the things I'm hearing, for example, I'm hearing that some clinics that used to do fresh donor cycles, meaning again, somebody finds a donor or knows somebody who's willing to donate, who in real time is undergoing the stimulation and the egg retrieval, that there are some clinics who are not doing that currently because they're trying as much as possible to lower the risk of people being in the clinic and have the least amount of people as possible. So instead, those clinics are accepting frozen eggs. because that doesn't require a donor to come in for screening. It doesn't require her to go in for cycle-monitoring. It doesn't require her to go in for egg retrieval or for follow-up care.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if you are interested, if you are underway in a plan to do egg donation, that would be a really important thing to find out if your clinic is still accepting fresh donor cycles, or if for the time being, they're only looking at doing frozen egg cycles.
Excellent. I imagine that we're hearing this through some of the clinics, some patients who are going through regular IVF or IUI or other treatments monitoring. There's a lot of no partners being allowed in the room or the clinic. So it's really taken away sort of, this is of course not only a couple, but there's a partnership in this family building, and having that support person or support people has sort of been taken back at this time.
Yes.
So I'm sure that's really difficult, not only on patients who are doing IVF for themselves, but also in the third party stream, where if you're using a surrogate and you're a same sex male couple and you can't be there for the retrieval or the transfer and all of those things, it's very difficult, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And I would say that that covers a few different areas. So one is the intended parents, but the other is also the surrogate or the donor. And actually, just to backtrack, to suggest also that people who are looking at gestational carriers also keep in mind borders. The borders now seem to be opening from province to province. But of course, that is something to keep in mind if you do have a surrogate from out of province. Keeping in mind that her coming in, your clinic, I just wanted to add that your clinic might have restrictions. I have heard some clinics will have a 14-day quarantine if you're flying in or taking a train. And so that if you're coming in from out of province, there may be some rules at your clinic about when you can actually go into the clinic. So again, if you have a donor or a surrogate coming in from out of province, a really important thing for you to check with your clinic what their rules are. Sorry, but to go back to what you were saying, Carolyn, I think it seems clear to me that for a variety of reasons, everybody now is a bit more vulnerable because of the pandemic. And I mean emotionally vulnerable. And so, for example, a lot of the gestational carriers I speak to have actually never been to a big city. So when they come into Toronto, I speak to lots of women who've never been on an airplane before. They live in a small town. And so what had been possible beforehand, let's say traveling in with a partner and staying at a hotel and then having the intended parents meet them and drive them around and be with them at the clinic, all of that was incredibly comforting and really wonderful. But now it's actually not so simple for them to have their partner come in, not only for the number of people, but also if their children aren't in school or aren't in summer camp, a partner needs to be there with them. And of course, because of bubbling, it's not like you can have babysitters come in and out of your home. So certainly in terms of that, egg donors and surrogates are more likely to be coming into towns and cities that they don't know well, going into medical procedures that they're not familiar with. So for certainly a heterosexual couple who were doing years of treatment prior to third party, they're used to the clinic system. They understand the acronyms. We spoke to that at the beginning. They understand what to expect. They know all of the things, but it's entirely possible that a donor and a surrogate doesn't. And not only might they not have a partner there, but they also then don't have the intended parents with them. For intended parents, stakes are so much higher. Some people have been waiting years to find the right surrogate, a very long time to be able to pick their donor, and then everything shut down. And so people's emotions are obviously at a higher state. And as you suggested, for some of those really important milestones, a transfer, an ultrasound, to not be able to be there is devastating. Certainly my recommendation is that people really be very mindful about how they can participate virtually. From what I'm hearing, clinics are being really open about that in a way that maybe might have been more complicated before, but clinics do recognize, and doctors and nurses and staff are aware of how distressing it is not to have a support person there with you. My understanding is that egg retrievals at, I think, almost all the clinics, they are allowing a support person there. And while initially they had said transfers, no, I am hearing now that a lot of clinics are allowing either an intended parent to be in for the transfer, or if it's, let's say, a gestational surrogate, like a partner or like one person whether that's a partner
Great.
or an intended parent. But I just, one of the things I'm suggesting to people is that they take all of those appointments that you would have gone to in person, take that time away from work, and it's actually taking less time if you're not going, and be part of it virtually. So for example, if you're not able to be in the room for a surrogate transfer, you can drive her there. You can wait downstairs, and you can be on a phone or a tablet by Zoom or Skype or FaceTime or any of these platforms and participating. The same thing with ultrasounds. So I'd really encourage people to speak to their clinic, find out what their clinic rules are around virtual participation, and really be honest with yourself about what is important to you and advocate for that. And if you're working with a known donor, if you're working with a surrogate, find out what they want, what's important for them in terms of your involvement, advocate for them as well. And if you're working with an agency and you are doing a fresh donor cycle and you don't have the ability to find out exactly what your donor needs, then I do encourage you to remember that she is a young woman. She is likely to be more vulnerable than ever if she's alone. And to find out from your agency, is she allowed to have somebody with her in the room if she needs it? Who can that be? How can you advocate for a donor even if you don't know her, just to make sure that she's getting the support, and that everybody is kind of looking out for everybody, knowing that if you can't have somebody with you in person, it is still possible to have that support virtually.
Of course. Thank you for touching on that. I think it's very important to remember that there are ways to connect. We actually have a Facebook comment that said that they were allowed to take part via FaceTime, and that might have probably been more present than physically being at the embryo transfer. So that's really important to ask and be open. Clinics I know are very open about that right now. So I'm really glad that you touched on that.
Absolutely.
What I'd love to know, Dara, sorry, oh, I have another question here. How do you even make the decision to use donor eggs, donor sperm, donor embryo, or a surrogate?
Great question. So of course, I would direct this answer more towards a hetero couple or individual, because somebody who is with, let's say, a lesbian couple, a gay couple, they know from the start that either it's adoption or fostering or third party. So let's say, speaking specifically to people who thought that they would have been able to do it on their own. And that might be a single woman who had hoped to be able to use her own eggs or carry herself. Let's say she knew that she'd have to use a sperm donor because she's alone, but she thought she could have done the other stuff on her, by herself, as well as a hetero couple. So I think one of the things that seems to be the most common thing I hear about when people start to make that switch is when what you're doing stops feeling possible and hopeful. So, I mean, I could speak to my own experience that, at first, everything we did felt like it was leading us to a baby. So we tried on our own, we tried timed intercourse, we tried cycle monitoring with medication, we tried insemination, we tried IVF, and like each one of those steps was a decision. And each time we were faced with that decision, it seemed like that was a good thing and it made us feel hopeful. By the time our third IVF wasn't successful, the idea of doing another IVF actually didn't fill me with hope anymore. It didn't seem possible that it was going to work. And certainly by the fourth, it was clear that it wasn't. And so one of the things that I hear from a lot of people is that feeling of despair, of hopelessness, of we're going down the wrong path, like feeling like you're kind of banging your head against a wall, that starts to feel more powerful. And so, whereas if somebody had said to me, what do you think of the idea of somebody else carrying a baby for you after my first IUI had failed, that would have been preposterous. Like it would have been laughable to think that I would even ever do something like that.
Of course.
But by the time my fourth IVF wasn't successful, the idea of doing another IVF was just as preposterous as the idea of doing surrogacy had been those 5 years before.
Of course.
So I think it's the idea that sometimes something else starts to feel more hopeful. And I think the important thing to note is that doesn't mean that the idea of not using your own sperm or egg, the idea of not being able to carry for yourself, that doesn't mean that is not going to fill you with some sadness. right? So it's not about people feeling 100% ready to do something, that they are 100% over the sadness or the grief or the complicated feelings of how they had imagined having a family. It's that the idea of doing something different fills you with more hope maybe than you felt in a long time, where it seems really unlikely that what you have been doing is ever going to be successful. And where you get to a point where you realize that you've spent so much time and so much money in one place and you're not moving forward. And this new thing that may feel deeply distressing and scary and all of those things also gives you a chance to do something that you're feeling like actually you haven't had for a while, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. Dara, how, I can imagine that at some points, one partner may be more accepting of moving forward with using a donor or a surrogate than the other. So if you find yourself in that situation where you would like to move forward, but your partner isn't on board or not as open to the idea, what do you suggest for couples who may find themselves in that situation?
That's a great question. And actually, I would say that one of the first things that is really essential when people are working with third party is that everybody is incredibly honest and authentic and open. And that has to start with yourself. So I'll give an example. There could be, let's say, a man who is not so comfortable with the idea of sperm donation, but doesn't even want to acknowledge that to himself, because if he's not comfortable with sperm donation, it means the woman he loves can't have a baby. So he doesn't even think about how he feels about sperm donation because he loves this woman so much and he wants her to have a baby and he wants to have a baby with her. So there's an opportunity there for him either to be authentic and honest in terms of how he is feeling and share that with her, or an opportunity that is lost and then comes back to bite both of them later on. So I think as people are moving through treatment and making decisions, it's really important that people, even before they're talking to their partner, that they're really doing some introspective work and thinking about how they feel about this. What are their concerns about this? And often when we're in relation with somebody else, our instinct is to protect them. Our instinct is to do things that are going to be good for them, that are going to make them happy. And that's amazing. I mean, that's why people have loving relationships. It also means that if that is your first instinct, you're actually not giving yourself an opportunity to be honest with yourself or with your partner. So I would say that from the very beginning, while it's important to be kind and respectful when having these conversations, it's equally important that people are being open about their fears, open about their concerns, and that way people can have realistic conversations. Sometimes the thing that makes somebody move from being 20% ready to do something to 70% ready to do something is actually information. So for example, when people are doing or considering third party, the two kind of appointments that I would offer would be one, I think what I mentioned earlier is the required one. So when people know that they're doing egg, sperm, embryo donation or surrogacy, they must speak to a counselor. They do implications counseling. Or if they're thinking of, or if they know they're going to be a donor or they know they're going to be a surrogate, they have to do a donor or surrogate assessment. But there are lots of people who one or both people are leaning that way, or it's looking like their doctor is suggesting that, but neither of them feel like that's what they want, but they're not sure. Then sometimes what is actually the best thing is not even to spend the money on the big kind of in-depth assessment or implications counseling, but actually just have a general counseling appointment. So somebody would send me a message and say, it looks like egg donation might be the next thing. We're not ready for it. Or my partner and I are not, like I'm ready, my partner's not, or my partner's ready and I'm not. And that's an appointment where you're coming in and you're talking about your concerns. And sometimes it's actually really just one concern that's so huge that it makes it not possible for you to imagine doing it. And so if you're able to be open and honest with your partner about what that concern is and what your worry is, it is possible through counseling support, you'll see a different way of looking at it, have a different understanding of it and become more comfortable or not. I mean, the truth is that just like anything else, this is not for everybody. And there are some people who will never be able to wrap their heads around using a donor or a surrogate. And it is more important to be able to be open and honest about that before somebody is pregnant. And so as
Wow,
devastating as that is to find out that you and a partner are on diametrically different places with this and that you could never come together on it, you would certainly want to know that before a child was conceived.
absolutely. Yeah, thank you for touching on that. It just came to me as you were speaking, and I thought we do see that question or concern come up in some of our support groups. And people wonder how they can talk to their partner or what they can do to get everybody at least on the same page for conversation.
Yeah. I mean,
So
one
thank
of the
you for
things that I would suggest in terms of how people think about it is, you know, when I said that idea that if somebody had suggested surrogacy when I did my first IUI, like, so when I was doing my first IUI, I was 0% ready to do surrogacy. I would say after my second IVF failed, I was probably maybe 30% ready. Like, nobody had suggested surrogacy at that point, but if somebody had, I would have been a little bit more on the side, right?
Of course.
So what I would say is sort of thinking about it as like a dial, like, where are you now? And where do you think you need to be, or your partner thinks they need to be before you can do it? And that answer should never be 100. Like, there are very few things in our life that we are 100% sure about. And something like donation and surrogacy is so huge, and there are so many unknowns. I think it is unrealistic to be 100% confident. So a good question to ask yourself, or your partner if you're partnered, is for us to do this, how comfortable do we need to be? If we're at 30%, could we get to 70%? Could we get to 80%? Like, would that make us feel comfortable? And what information would we need to move us from 0 to 30 or 30 to 50 or 50 to 70?
That is excellent advice. I think that's really, that dial and that visual, I think, is very important. Also very important to say you don't need to be at 100%.
I think that, look, I mean, I'm never not going to be sad that I didn't carry my kids. Like, there's never going to be a time in my life where that doesn't bring me sadness. The difference is that before I did surrogacy, everything about surrogacy brought me sadness. And now the fact that I wasn't able to carry a pregnancy brings me sadness, but the idea of surrogacy brings me joy, because that's what brought me my children. So I think that the idea that somehow you have to wrap your head around something, it's a loss, right? Like, when somebody you love dies, you never get over that. You never stop missing them or stop loving them. It just stops being as painful as time goes on. And so I definitely would encourage people to think about this in that kind of way. No matter what somebody says, no matter how happy your outcome is, there is a loss from what you had imagined if you're a hetero couple to what ends up happening. And it's okay to recognize that loss, to grieve that loss, and to be unbelievably joyful at the outcome you have. Because in fact, if I had conceived children on my own without help with that first IUI, the kids I have now wouldn't exist. Like, they literally wouldn't exist.
So interesting,
amazing, right? So that's so to be able to be at a place where you can recognize the loss, be honest with yourself that it is a loss, do the self-care that you need to do to work through those feelings of sadness, and also set the stage so you can move forward. There's a great quote that I love, which is, we must let go of the life we have planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us.
So true. Thank you for touching on that. I think it's really important. And I think, or I could assume that a lot, based on conversations that I see, that this can be a sticky point for people. And obviously not everybody, but it's important to put it into perspective a bit and gather the information to help you turn that dial.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we have a Facebook question. What are the factors you should consider when selecting a donor or a surrogate?
So, good question. So I would say it's a combination of what I think of as being like a checklist, and also a heart feeling. So with a donor, for example, the checklist would include, most people I speak to, the top thing on their checklist is race. People are matching racially. People are often matching the person whose genetics are not being used. They're looking at hair color and eye color, sometimes height and weight. People are looking at health history and education. So people are tending initially with their checklist to look at things that their traits that they're hoping to pass along. So that makes sense. Most people do that. I would definitely encourage people, though, to also take a breath and to recognize that a lot of those things that are on your checklist are not necessarily going to be transferred to your child. So there are some things that will, for sure, race. But actually, education is about access. It's about privilege. It's not about intelligence. We all know incredibly intelligent people who, based on their life circumstance, are not well educated, but they're bright and they're interesting and they are engaging people. And maybe in a different circumstance they might have had an education, but it certainly hasn't held them back or stopped them. And I think we all know people who are highly educated that we're like, I can't believe that person is so like,
Definitely.
We all know people on both sides. So I would say keep that in mind. The other thing, of course, is that donors are young. So a 20-year-old sperm donor that you see on a sperm bank who says that he's going to be a doctor, I mean, maybe he will and maybe he won't. Like he's 20, right? And the same thing with athleticism. I mean, I think that there are things that we can recognize are likely to be, there's a genetic aspect to some skills. But I think it's also, we all can recognize that just because one person is athletic, it doesn't mean their kid is going to be athletic. And
For sure.
I feel like it would be a pretty heartbreaking feeling if a child said to you, why did you pick my donor? And you said, well, they were really athletic and they were really, they had great grades in university and they were really athletic. And you have a kid maybe who's struggling in school and who isn't athletic and who feels like, oh, I guess maybe you didn't get the kid you wanted from the donor you picked.
Right. Very, very important.
So I think it's reasonable to have a checklist. Everybody has a checklist. I think that what's a useful thing to ask yourself, though, is when my child asks me why I picked this donor, what am I going to say? And you certainly, I hope, would like to be able to say something other than they were this particular race and this particular height and studying this in school. It would be very nice to have things that also felt like they resonated with you. That said, I also want to be sensitive to the fact that that's not always possible, right? So somebody who's Caucasian, who's looking for an egg donor who is, blonde and white, is likely to find a lot of donors. Somebody who's looking for a donor who's part Métis or who's, part Hispanic and part Japanese. The truth is that there are a lot of racialized populations that are not represented well in donors. And to find those donors is really difficult. So I also want to just recognize the fact that if you're looking, for example, for an Ethiopian donor, then you may not have the luxury that somebody who's white has, where they can choose between 30 different donors and choose the one that kind of warms their heart. And that's totally fair enough. But if you do have the option, then I would say, along with your checklist, to also see if there's something with that donor that does resonate with you, and to give that as much as much emphasis as you would the other things. Because it's also important to remember that while health, of course, is important, that a 20-year-old donor who has no history in her family of heart disease or cancer or mental illness, or she's 20. So that doesn't mean that those things aren't going to come up in the next number of years.
Right.
So you want to do your due diligence, of course, but also take a breath and remember that we all know people who are very similar to genetically linked family members. We all know people who are vastly different. And so you don't want to get too caught up in those kinds of things.
For sure. Let's talk a little bit about anonymous donation. Is donation in Canada, is it anonymous? Can it be anonymous? Is that recommended? I know we live in the world of Ancestry.ca and 23andMe. What's the recommendation there for, or the rules or those sorts of things?
I mean, I would say, I think myself, as well as most, if not, I don't want to say all, but many of us actually don't think that it's appropriate that the language of anonymity is being used anymore, that there's no such thing as anonymous. The truth is, if you have a child who at some point in their life does 23andMe or Ancestry.com, those things are $100 now. So if we're talking about a child who's being conceived now, 20 years from now, they're going to be able to access that easily and for very little money. And if their donor's third cousin did that test,
Right.
I suspect your child would be able to find them, and them to find your child probably within an afternoon.
Absolutely.
So I think it's really important to recognize that the idea of anonymity is actually not a thing anymore. Like that's not something that anybody can guarantee on either way. Because these tests are out there, social media is out there, people do have the capacity to find each other in a way they didn't before. Those things are still being offered, and there are certainly people who feel more comfortable with that. I guess what I would say is that we are living in a world where everything is more open. For example, my understanding is that if you're adopting in Canada, if you're doing a domestic adoption in Canada, it cannot be anonymous anymore. It has to be open. That doesn't mean a forced relationship, but it does mean that everybody would know who everybody is.
Okay.
And so I think it is important to recognize that children who are being conceived now, who are going to be growing up in Canada, are going to be growing up in a world that's very different than how we grew up, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Openness is really the way of the future. It's important to remember that in terms of the world that our kids are living in, they're also going to be exposed to things that we weren't. So for example, every other week, a new Hollywood movie star is having a baby with an egg donor, with a sperm donor, with a surrogate. Like these things are not a secret anymore. They're very open. Our children are going to be in school with families that look all different kinds of ways. So a hetero couple have the option of keeping their use of a donor a secret. And the truth is, after a baby is a few months old, even keeping the use of a surrogate a secret, right? Like the only reason people know I used a surrogate is because I said so. Like it's not like people are asking to see evidence of me when I was pregnant. So, a hetero couple has the option of keeping that a secret. But their kid is going to be in school with people who've got single parents, who have parents from LGBTQ populations and communities. And so there's such a mix now that our children are going to be meeting other kids who were conceived with donors, who were conceived with surrogates, who were adopted, who live in blended families. Like there's such a mix now. So I think not only is the secrecy no longer needed in the same way that maybe it would have been in the past, it's also not a secret anymore. Like our families are out there. So what I would say one of the big differences to me when I think about it is that if you choose a donor now who's anonymous, you're doing a couple of things. One is you're closing a door. So that means that if in 10 years or 15 years, you wish you had made a different choice, it's too late. Like you've made that choice. And so you've limited things in whatever way you've limited them. As opposed to if you choose an open ID, which is so identity release means that when your child is 18, they can find out the name and the information of the donor. Now that information is not released to the donor, but again, if your child does any of these tests and the donor does, it is possible the donor can find them, but there's no mechanism in place to ease that process from the donor to the child, as opposed to the donor being able to find out who the child can find who the donor is. But the difference is that if you choose an open identification donor, you're choosing somebody who is aware of the fact that they may be contacted, who's accepted the fact that they might be contacted. And I wonder, although I don't know, but I wonder if that also means that as they grow and as they maybe build their own family, that maybe they are open about the fact that they were a donor. Their partner maybe does know it because they have spent the next 20 years knowing that they might be found, as opposed to somebody who was promised anonymity, who donated on the assumption that it would be anonymous, is not expecting to be found. They actively do not want to be found. And it's very possible 20 years later are no longer thinking about it and haven't shared that with families. So I also wonder, and I don't know, but I also wonder if in choosing an open ID donor, I wonder if maybe you are more likely, if your child is eventually looking for information about their history, if they're more likely to find somebody who is willing to give them those answers.
Right. That's really important. And I think, when you're making that decision, ultimately there's a child involved. And if, they turn 18, it's access to information for them and the choices they want to make for their life. And so if you're choosing open, does that mean you're giving more options for your child? Like you're allowing them the decision at the end, or?
I mean, I think that it's important to recognize that this doesn't guarantee anything in the way that, you know, there are lots of children who are adopted who are very, very interested in finding birth families and spend a lot of time searching. There are also people who are adopted who sort of feel like, yeah, if they were in the next room, I'd want to meet them, but actually it doesn't take up a lot of my energy or time. Like I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, and I'm certainly not interested in searching. And there are also people who are adopted who actively do not want to, who say like, actually, no, I don't want to meet them. I'm happy with the life I have. That's not what I want. I'm not curious at all. So I think that it's important that we aren't assuming that a child is going to run off as soon as they turn 18 and leave the family that they've been raised with to find somebody else. But it's also important to recognize that they might very well have questions about themselves, about their background. And those questions, if they're not answered, are not going to just go away. There's something about secrets that builds over time. Secrets don't get smaller over time, they get bigger over time. And there's certainly enough research out there that suggests that children who are not told that they're donor conceived and who find out inadvertently, as many of them do, that it is incredibly traumatic. It's destabilizing for the family and it's traumatizing for the child.
Thank you for going there. That was where I wanted to go next, to say, what does the research suggest for being open, not only with your child, but also maybe your family and friends?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's interesting. I think about this decision for a hetero couple to make, and also I would imagine for, let's say, a single woman who is using a sperm donor, and everyone knows she's using a sperm donor, but maybe they don't know that at 42, she's also using an egg donor. Right. So that option, maybe she's being open about the sperm donor part, but not about the egg donor part.
Right.
So when you're talking about somebody who is in a position to hide this if they choose to, I think about that choice of whether or not to tell your child that you used a donor, that they were donor conceived. I think about that as being actually the first parenting choice that you make, because you have all kinds of feelings that are completely reasonable and totally understandable. Feelings of grief and of loss, of fear and of insecurity and of sadness. Like there are so many feelings that are so understandable and reasonable to have. So the question to ask yourself is, am I going to make a decision that's going to deeply impact my child based on my feelings, those feelings, or what I believe is best for my child? And I'm certainly not going to suggest that there's never a circumstance where that secrecy isn't actually appropriate. For example, there are children who have developmental disabilities, cognitive disabilities, that they actually would never quite understand it, and it would truly only cause pain and confusion. Mm-hmm. There also are cultural things that have to be taken into account, where if you live in a tight community where you are 100% confident that your child would be ostracized, that they would not be accepted into the family, that you would be thrown out of your community, like I would certainly never suggest that openness is the best for every single person. That's clearly not true. But I do think it's important to ask the question about whether you're making the decision based on what you honestly, truly believe is best for a child, or if it's what you're worried about. So often people are afraid that a child will be teased, and they're afraid that a child will be bullied or people will make fun of them. And that may be true, but kids get teased for all kinds of reasons. Kids get teased for being fat or skinny, for having dark skin or lighter skin. Well, not lighter skin, unfortunately. We don't live in a world where that's what people are teased about. Where they're teased for how they do in school, where they're teased for how they do or don't do well in sports, or so I sort of feel like as parents, our job is to do everything we can to support the well-being and the mental health of our kids. We can't protect them from everything.
For sure.
And so what can we do at the start to make sure that the story of their conception of their family is one that they feel proud of, that they know that you're proud of? Mm-hmm. And that goes back to those ideas of recognizing the ways in which you're vulnerable, recognizing the ways in which you need to be open and authentic about your feelings. And if you're somebody who has jumped into donation or surrogacy before you felt like it was something that you could navigate, and you end up with a child that you actually weren't prepared for because you didn't do the work to accept how you feel, and you still have significant feelings of shame and grief, then that does become complicated, as opposed to being at a place where you're able to feel sadness, of course, at some of the things that have been lost, but also joy at the fact that that is what brought you your child.
Absolutely. And there are resources out there. I know there's books and other tools that help you start those conversations with your child at young ages. As a parent of children who were born through IVF and ICSI, I have some of those books, and I've been very open about didn't use third party, but we thought it was very important for our family to have those conversations early. And those tools are there, and they help us with the language and the wording to explain to young minds.
Absolutely. And I would say, you asked like, what are good ways of, in terms of talking to kids, in terms of talking to families. And certainly I would say that for people who are hesitant about talking about this at the start, and for lots and lots of people, especially people who've been through so much to get to the point of egg donation and surrogacy, the idea of disclosing that you're using a donor or a surrogate before there's a pregnancy, before there's a baby, it seems so premature because you've had so much heartbreak and heartache beforehand that announcing this huge thing about a baby that it feels like maybe might not even exist just seems like untenable. And I totally understand that. I do suggest that people use, I call it like the breadcrumb theory, where if people don't even know that you've been struggling and they have no idea that you've been at a clinic, that you've done IVF, that you've been trying, if they don't even know that, and then 5 years from now they found out you used a donor, that's quite a leap. So one of the things that you can look at is, are there people that you can start to let know that you're struggling a bit, that you're looking at different things? There's a difference between privacy and secrecy. Secrecy is nobody knows ever. You will take this to the grave. You will never tell your child. You will never speak of it again. You are going to go through your life pretending that this didn't happen. Privacy is you're planning on telling your child, you're going to tell your child's doctor, and maybe you have a few trusted family members or friends that you feel like you can confide in. So we all have the right to privacy. And so it's also important to know that disclosure doesn't mean announcing it on Facebook. Deciding to be open with your child doesn't mean you have to tell everybody in the world. That said, it's also reasonable to understand that if your child is going to know that that information is no longer yours to keep, your child can tell whoever they want. And that is also true. Yeah.
That's really important. Thank you for touching on that. This conversation is so important. And I know we've got lots of people watching right now, and I'm hoping that people are taking pieces of this, of what we're talking about today, and it's helping them along this journey. I have a question here. If you or your partner can't be in the room for a transfer, and I don't know if you can answer this, but how does that affect the bonding process with your baby, or would it, do you think, or is that a concern?
I think that's a great question. People have significant concerns around the idea of bonding, whether that's because they're using a donor or using a surrogate. And I would say, I mean, to start, I have not done a ton of research in the area of child bonding, and I'm certainly, if somebody is, has an article that suggests something different than what I'm going to say, I'm certainly not going to say that I have all of the information in the world on this. What I do believe, though, is that I believe that a lot of ideas about bonding, particularly for women, are incorrect and really wrapped up in what society's ideas of motherhood are. And I can say that as somebody who desperately wanted to carry my own kids and didn't. And they are now 14 and 16, and I am very, very bonded with them and them with me. And the fact that I didn't carry them has nothing to do with it. And I see that all the time with the people I speak to who use surrogates, who use donors. There is somehow an assumption that if you're a woman, that as soon as you find out you're pregnant, you are immediately bonded. As soon as that baby is born, you immediately fall madly in love. That when you breastfeed, that is a deep bonding experience. And actually, none of that is true for all women. It is true for some women, absolutely. But there are lots of women who actually don't like being pregnant. And not only because they feel sick, but there are lots of women who don't feel sick, but just don't like being pregnant. And there are lots of women who actually don't bond immediately, that they find the newborn stage overwhelming and exhausting and boring and difficult. They're grateful to have a child, but they don't fall madly in love with a being that needs from them all of the time.
Mhm.
And while lots of women love breastfeeding, lots of women actually don't. Lots of women struggle with it. They find it painful and awful, and actually it can have a significant impact on somebody's mental health when they feel like that's all they can do and they can't do that. And the flip side is that people bond beautifully with babies that come into their homes through adoption. People bond beautifully with children that come into their lives in various different ways. And certainly there are throughout history people who have bonded beautifully with children that they have not breastfed. So I think what you can do is you can think about who are the people in your life that you are really bonded to and why. And for those of us that do have close relationships with, for example, a parent or a sibling, it's true that what started that relationship might have been a genetic link, or it might have been that it was your mom who carried you. The reason why you're close with them is not because of sperm and egg or uterus.
Mhm.
The same way for people who have partners, I always say, like, you guys aren't genetically related. Like when I think about my best friend, I'm not genetically related to her. And I think all of us know people who are estranged from family members, who have multiple siblings. One is their best friend and one they don't really like very much. One who they have a step parent who they never call a step parent. They're like, that's my dad or that's my sister. They never use language of step or half. And there are other people who say like, oh yeah, that's my mother's husband.
Right.
Like he's not their stepfather. He didn't raise them.
Mhm.
Right. So I think being able to sort of look at, how did genetics actually play out in our life? Like, who are the people that we know that we would go to, that we would call in the middle of the night? And why are we bonded to them? And it's actually because of our actual history with them. It's because of our life experience. So that doesn't mean that not being there at a moment of transfer, or if it's with a gestational carrier missing the birth, I'm not suggesting that that wouldn't be upsetting and distressing. Of course it would. And of course that's a loss, that you've missed out on that. But that does not inform your entire relationship with your child. Because when people are using third party, children who come into the world through donation, through surrogacy, are the most wanted children in the entire world. None of us are like, oh, whoops, I guess we better kind of make a go of it and see if this is going to be okay. Like,
Right.
I mean, these are the most intended, purposeful children. They are children who are coming into a world where everybody involved in their conception wants them and wants the people who are going to be their parents to be their parents.
Yes.
So the tragedy that happens in third party are personal tragedies for individuals who had hoped to use their own genetics, who had hoped to carry themselves. But the tragedy of birth is not there. Like this is a child that's coming into the world with so much love. And they're going into a family that wants them, that's waited for them often for years and years and years. And there are some studies that show, in fact, that children who are born through donation and surrogacy in the first 5 years of life actually have stronger levels of attachment to parents because they're coming into families that are ready for them.
Wow, that's very powerful.
Mentally, like we're ready for our babies.
Yeah.
And that, I think, does more than anything else for bonding.
Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that statistic or that research.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's really important, and I'm sure that that is a concern. And like you said, going back, we're never 100% sure. And if you've got some of these questions or concerns about using third party reproduction or surrogacy options, when you have data like that to help, that information to help you move forward to make your decision, it's so powerful.
Absolutely. And that is a good question to ask yourself. It's sort of the difference between, I wish I could do egg donation or sperm donation, but I don't think I can. Like I wish that I was comfortable with surrogacy, but I'm not. That's a person who might benefit from speaking to a counselor and seeing, can you become comfortable with it?
Yeah.
Somebody who says, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want to learn about it. I'm never going to be comfortable with that. That is, there are some people who feel that way. You have the right. So that's a good question to ask yourself. Like, is that something that you wish you were comfortable with because you wish that you could do it? Because you see a light at the tunnel and you think, I I can never imagine wrapping my head around this to do it. I wish I could. I don't know that I can. So that's somebody who's in actually a really nice position to access counseling supports to see, okay, can you move that dial from 30 to 50 to 70? Maybe not, but actually maybe so.
But maybe so. That's really important. So if you're out there and you're watching this session, whether it's live right now on Zoom or Facebook, and you're interested in exploring options or accessing counseling sessions, please connect with us. We're happy to put you through to Dara to see if that could be a good fit. You can have a conversation there. Dara, in closing, we're coming up to an hour. It's amazing how time can go so quickly when you're really engaged in something so powerful. Do you have any final thoughts or information you'd like to share?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd say two things. One is if you choose to do donation or surrogacy, that you may be fortunate that everybody around you is understanding of your choice and supportive of your choice. You may be in a situation where that's not actually the case. And I do encourage people to think about the difference between support and understanding, that we do make decisions sometimes as adults that people around us don't understand, but that doesn't mean they can't support us. So I think it can happen where you've made a choice that feels emotional for you and complicated for you. And when people you love don't understand that choice, you end up having lots of discussions trying to convince them why you're making the right choice. And you end up feeling really frustrated and vulnerable and devastated. So I would really encourage people when they're making such huge life choices around how you're going to build your family to really think about the people in your life that you go to for support and ask yourself what you need from them. If you are going to be talking to them, do you need their understanding because it's your partner, because it's your best friend, or what you need ultimately is them to say, I support you. Maybe I don't understand it. Maybe I don't even agree with it. But at the end of the day, I love you. I will support your choice. I'm here for you. So I know that people can end up getting into a lot of discussions that feel fruitless and causing a lot of ongoing stressor with people who don't understand. And that goes for people, for example, women who want to be surrogates, women who want to be donors, who people around them are like, I just don't understand why you would do this. To be able to say, okay, that's okay if you don't understand. What I need you to do is support my choice. And so I think for our own mental health, it can be really beneficial to figure out what it is that we want from people before we disclose. Because with disclosure, it's out there. So you want to be sure you understand what you want from people before you're making that disclosure.
That's really good advice.
And part of that will also circle back to the ideas that we spoke about before. Everybody is feeling more vulnerable than they ever have. We're feeling isolated. We're feeling anxious about and uncertain about the future. And people who are doing third party have often been in a situation of feeling vulnerable and anxious and uncertain and deeply distressed for a long time. So this pandemic has just built on that. So I think to really look at your own self-care as a priority now, to be open and authentic with yourself about what you need, to be open with your partner. If you're working with an agency, if you're working with a known donor or a surrogate, to, of course, be respectful in conversations, but not to be afraid to say what it is that you want, because we only get what we want when we ask for it. And so it's really important to make sure that we're looking at all these pieces together, our own vulnerability, what it is that we want, what we need, and we're taking the steps we need to take care of ourselves in a time that is so uncertain and can feel so scary.
Very, very, very good advice. Thank you for that. So, Dara, I want to thank you so much for your time and your information, and you're always so informative and educational. And I know that so many people will learn so much from this session. Thank you if you've been tuning in live. We're thrilled that you're here. We're so happy to be able to bring you these figuring out fertility information sessions so that you can make more informed decisions about your reproductive health options. Please make sure, if you're interested, to check out our Facebook page in the events section. We've got 2 sessions happening next week, and we are booking them right through into the early fall now. So please continue to check our Facebook events section, or visit fertilitymatters.ca and our events on that site if you're interested in more of these sessions. Dara, thank you. And if you need more information and would like to connect with Dara, please contact fertilitymatters.ca and we will help you get in contact with Dara. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.